Democracy originally meant that it's the people who hold the power and exercise rule. You say that in terms of today's democracy, that's a thumping falsehood. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, it's not what we have today, because very obviously I don't rule the United Kingdom and you don't rule the United Kingdom, and so you could argue about how many people do rule it, but certainly not very many people rule it, and they very definitely aren't most of the citizens. In Athens, the citizens weren't a very large proportion of the population, but they did take all the major public decisions, and there weren't very many people who were chosen to exercise special power. It was really only in war that the military leaders were elected, and that was seen as a rather undemocratic practice, but as obviously necessary, because in a war you wanted to be quite sure that you were led by the people who were most likely to lead you to victory.
Do you think that democracy as it exists today has changed for better or for worse?
First of all, democracy is a Greek word for naming that particular set of Greek arrangements a long time ago. Those arrangements essentially disappeared 2,500 years ago, roughly, or a little bit less, and they haven't ever really reappeared except on a very small scale, and they don't have much to do with the way in which any modern state is governed. Modern states are much bigger, and they are governed through complicated public bureaucracies, and they're governed by relatively small numbers of, in a sense, professional politicians. And that is a very different structure, and it's ridiculous to describe that as rule by the people.
In today's Western world, democracy has become the only acceptable form of government. How did that happen?
Well, it's essentially happened because the two principal competitors to it in Western history, monarchy and aristocracy, collapsed in the course of the 19th and 20th century. And what we now call democracy is what was left instead, which involves all the citizens, or almost all the citizens, in at least a notional form, in the way that power is actually held, but involves them very, very sporadically and pretty feebly, I think one could say.
Do you think democracy can be used to cover up undesirable elements in the political system?
Well, I think it always is. I mean, that is, in a way, the main point I want to make. I mean, democracy is both the name of a form of government, not very clearly defined form of government, and a political pretension or a political claim, which is that the form of government is actually authorized by the people at large. The very, very great majority of states in the world have governments which claim to be authorized by the people at large. But if you ask how the people actually do their authorizing, the answer is they have a very, very small bit part, really. They intervene in some countries barely at all, and in any countries only every few years, and very briefly, and in a way which gives them extremely little control over the outcome.
The neoconservative movement in the US has had a profound effect on democracy. Could you describe that?
Roughly speaking, since the end of the Second World War, the United States has definitely been of the opinion that the rest of the world should be governed in much the same way as it was governed, and it has been much the most powerful state in the world over that period of time. And it's insisted with varying vehemence and varying coerciveness on the merits of its way of its approach to governing as opposed to other people's. And obviously, for a long period of time, between shortly after the end of the Second World War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was essentially in a global power struggle with a completely different way of organizing power, and both of which, I mean, called themselves democracy, and both of which had some grounds for calling themselves democracy, and neither of which, on the account I'm offering, have, you know, very strong grounds for calling themselves democracy, because that isn't what democracy meant.
The US version of democracy is viewed with suspicion and anger in the Islamic world and also in parts of Latin America. Is sponsoring insurgency part of 21st century democracy?
The United States has no particular insight into most of the rest of the world. And it's had for a long time a very considerable surplus of power over any other potential competitor, and it has developed a very considerable overconfidence about its capacity to judge what's good and bad for other countries. And obviously under the George W. Bush presidency, it interfered a lot in other parts of the world on the basis of that judgment in a very indiscreet way.
And yet that is how democracy is seen, isn't it, nowadays, in this sort of evangelical way. And in fact, George W. Bush himself said that democracy was the best weapon in fighting terrorism. What did you think when he said that?
I thought he was a fool. I thought he was a fool, and the people behind him were knaves, if you see what I mean. I mean, that claim was made in defense of a very forward military and political policy on the United States in various parts of the world, and that policy has not proved at all wise, and it was inherently objectionable in some respects. There weren't no decent motives behind it at all, but there were a lot of not very decent motives behind it, and it was a very stupid policy.
What has the removal of dictatorial regimes in both Iraq and Afghanistan taught us about the process of democratisation?
The process of democratisation, you could say, is progress towards a very good outcome, which hasn't actually come out anywhere in the world so far. So if you have an ambitious conception of democratisation, what those two experiences taken together have taught us is that it's absolutely hopeless to try to move fast in a direction of that kind by bombing countries to pieces and invading them without bothering to inform yourself about what was, about the views and beliefs and practices of most of their inhabitants. I mean, neither Iraq under Saddam Hussein, a very horrible man indeed, nor Afghanistan, which isn't really under anyone ever, were at all promising candidates for rapid democratization, and it isn't possible to democratize anywhere by bombing it and invading it.
Do you think that democracy is, in essence, compatible with Eastern and Islamic philosophies?
Yes, I do. I think it's quite likely that in the longer run, any Islamic country which is really successful economically will flourish culturally and will end up insisting on something much more like what we call democracy as its governmental system. But it won't be able to do so rapidly, and there's a lot of stuff in the way. I don't think it's true, for example, that Iran couldn't be what we call a democracy. It was the Iranians, or the majority of them, who were moving in that direction. It can't be assisted to do so by being molested from the outside.
You hold that introducing democracy into undemocratic societies ultimately has negative effects. Could you explain that?
Well, it depends on how you do the introducing a bit. I mean, you could say, in a way, that in the very long run, Britain introduced democracy into India, but it did so jolly slowly. And the absolutely crucial point is that at the point that it introduced democracy, it withdrew briskly, and the Indians got on with it in their own way. And the result is much the biggest democracy in the world in our understanding of democracy, and although it has some pretty alarming characteristics, in many ways it's been a triumphant success.
And yet you're particularly pessimistic about the ability of democracy to bring peace to the Middle East.
Well, I do think that the Middle East is not the sort of place where democracy is going to assist peace fast. I mean, it is a very important fact that the most peace-averse group amongst the Palestinians won the elections in Gaza, and they won the elections in Gaza because more of the population of Gaza agreed with their vision of what was going on and what it meant than with that of their opponents. And I think that, I mean, Israel, anyway, within the Jewish part of the population, I mean, has been a democracy since it became a state. but it hasn't become much more pacific as a result of being a democracy. And it started off in a very bad place. And it's not at all clear to me how it can get back from that position, but it is clear to me that democracy is irrelevant.
Professor John Dunn, thank you very much.